The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the park as the air buzzed with the heavy heat of a summer afternoon. A group of young men were lounging near the fountain, their laughter echoing in the otherwise quiet space. They were used to the simple things in life. Their world was small and comfortable, where everyone around them either blended in or was ignored. Among them was Brad, the leader, whose sharp tongue and quick wit had earned him the respect of his friends. He squinted through the heat, catching sight of something that didn't quite belong in their world. A man in a wheelchair, rolling slowly along the path, his face hidden behind dark glasses. The man's presence, calm and composed, seemed out of place in this vibrant, noisy space. "Hey, look at this," Brad said, pointing with a grin. "What's this guy doing here? You think he's lost or something?" The group fell into an awkward silence, staring at the stranger. His dark skin, the worn wheelchair, and his stoic demeanor seemed to confuse them. They had no idea who he was, or why he was there. But they could see that he was different. And different meant weak in their eyes. "Let's mess with him," Kyle, one of Brad's followers, said with a mischievous smirk. "He looks like an easy target." The others nodded, intrigued, as they watched Kyle walk toward the man, eager to have some fun at his expense. The wheelchair-bound man kept moving, unfazed by the approaching group. But when Kyle blocked his path, the man stopped. There was no surprise in his eyes, just a quiet resolve. Kyle grinned and leaned down, his voice dripping with mockery. "Where do you think you're going, man? You need help or something?" The others snickered behind him, their eyes narrowing with amusement. But the man didn't respond. His gaze was steady, his posture calm. Brad joined in, nudging Kyle aside to get in the man's face. "Yeah, look at you. You should be grateful we even let you in here. What's it like to be a cripple?" The air grew heavier as the mocking continued. The group surrounded the man, their words sharp and cutting, all aimed at making him feel small. But still, the man didn't react. His silence only seemed to fuel their aggression. "Can't talk? Maybe you're too weak to even hear us," Brad taunted. "Maybe you should just go home." The others laughed, each one taking a step closer, pushing him into a corner. They were sure they had won. They were the ones in control after all. But then, without warning, the man spoke. His voice was low yet firm. "You don't know anything about me." The words hung in the air, stopping the boys cold. For a moment, they were confused. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. "Who are you, some kind of saint?" Kyle sneered, unsure of himself for the first time. The man didn't flinch. His gaze remained unyielding, piercing through Kyle's facade. "You have no idea who you're messing with?" Brad frowned, looking back at the others. They were starting to lose their bravado. What was happening? Who was this guy? One of the boys, Chris, squinted at the man's shirt. "Wait, I've seen that logo before. Are you the champion?" The man's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. He didn't say anything at first, but the change in his posture was enough. "Yeah," he said slowly, letting the words sink in. "I am." The realization hit them like a wave. Their laughter died, their confidence evaporating in an instant. The man wasn't just a disabled stranger, he was a world champion. A champion they had been mocking and humiliating for no reason other than their own ignorance. "Wait, you're a champion?" Kyle stammered, his face pale. The man's eyes locked onto his, cold and steady. "You think you can just treat me like this?" His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The boys didn't know how to respond. The arrogance that had defined them just moments before was now slipping away, replaced with a suffocating sense of shame. Kyle took a step back, but the man didn't move. He simply stared at them, his presence growing larger, filling the space around them. Finally, the man spoke again, his words piercing through their guilt. "I don't need your pity. But I do need you to understand something. Your actions have consequences." They stood frozen, unable to look him in the eye. How could they have been so blind? How could they have thought that their words and actions didn't matter? The man didn't wait for an apology. He didn't need one. With a single glance at the group, he turned his wheelchair around and rolled away, leaving them behind, stunned, humiliated, and utterly defeated. As the man disappeared down the path, the group stood in silence. The park, once full of life and laughter, now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of their realization. The world they had known, where they could mock others without consequence, had just shattered. They weren't the ones in control anymore. The next morning, Brad couldn't shake the weight of yesterday's events. The park was quieter than usual, the air thick with tension. Normally, their group was loud and carefree, but today, every word felt forced. Brad, usually the one to brush things off, felt uneasy. What if that man comes back? He kept thinking. He met up with Kyle and Chris at the usual spot, but there was something different in the air. Kyle was looking around nervously, almost as if he expected the man from yesterday to appear any moment. Chris was quieter than usual, his eyes flicking toward every passerby. "You think he'll come back?" Kyle asked, glancing over his shoulder. Brad shrugged, trying to sound casual, though he could feel the knot in his stomach. "Nah, he's probably forgotten about us." Chris shook his head. "You saw the way he looked at us. He wasn't just some guy. He wasn't scared. He was different." Brad didn't want to admit it, but he knew Chris was right. That man had a presence, an unshakable confidence that made them feel small, exposed. He was unlike anyone Brad had ever encountered. The group carried on with the day, but the feeling of unease lingered. Brad's mind kept returning to that moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, and the consequences of their actions were still looming over them. Later that afternoon, Brad decided to take a walk alone. He needed to clear his head. The park had always been his refuge, but now it felt colder, more ominous. The familiar streets seemed unfamiliar, and the air around him was thick with a quiet tension. As he turned into a quieter alley that led out of the park, he froze. There, in the distance, sitting by the alley's entrance, was the man from yesterday. The same calm expression, the same wheelchair. For a moment, Brad's heart skipped a beat, and he debated turning around. But something, a strange pull of curiosity mixed with fear, stopped him. The man's eyes lifted slowly as Brad approached, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was no anger in the man's eyes, no hate, just a quiet understanding, as if he had been waiting for Brad to face him. The atmosphere between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Brad hesitated. "Hey," he said, his voice sounding small in the quiet of the alley. The man turned his head slightly, acknowledging him with a slow nod. "You again." Brad swallowed. "I didn't mean to upset you yesterday. We didn't know who you were." The man's expression didn't change, but Brad could feel the weight of his gaze. "You didn't know me, but you judged me just the same." Brad looked away, uncomfortable. He wanted to explain, to make it right, but the words stuck in his throat. "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just messing around." The man's smile was faint, but it held no warmth. "Messing around? You think that's what it was? Just messing around?" Brad's stomach twisted. The words stung more than he expected. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he muttered, But even as he spoke, he knew the apology felt hollow. How could he undo what they'd done? How could he take back the judgment, the ridicule? The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze unflinching. You don't get it, do you? You think I'm just some guy you can dismiss. But you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. You never stop to wonder why I'm here. Brad swallowed again, a wave of guilt washing over him. The man was right. They hadn't thought twice. All they had seen was an easy target, someone they could mock, someone they could belittle. But now, with the man looking at him with that unwavering gaze, everything felt different. It felt wrong. I don't know what you want from me, Brad whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The man's eyes softened, just for a moment, before they hardened again. I don't want anything from you. But you need to understand something. Actions have consequences, Brad. You can't treat people like they don't matter and walk away like nothing happened. Brad felt his breath catch in his throat. The words cut through him, deeper than any insult he had ever heard. I didn't mean to treat you like that, he stammered. It wasn't supposed to be like that. The man's lips parted in a slow smile, but there was no humor in it. No, it wasn't. But it doesn't change the fact that you did. He paused, his gaze never leaving Brad. And now you have to live with that? Brad stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in. The world felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. He had thought it would be easy, just brush it off, forget about it, and move on. But now, facing this man, he realized that the consequences weren't something he could escape. You're going to have to change how you see people, Brad, the man continued. You're going to have to learn to stop judging others just because they don't fit into your narrow view of the world. Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense, no excuse. The man was right. You can walk away if you want, the man said, his voice calm. But you won't forget this. You won't forget what you did to me. Brad didn't know what to say. He just stood there, staring at the man, feeling as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had thought he was in control, that he understood the world. But now, in this moment, he realized how little he truly understood. The man wheeled his chair back, turning slightly away from Brad. I hope you think about what I said, Brad. I hope you never forget what it feels like to be judged. As the man rolled away, Brad stood motionless, the silence pressing in on him. The weight of the conversation hung over him like a cloud. He couldn't escape it. The world had changed, and so had he. He didn't know how, but he knew that this encounter would stay with him forever. The next few days felt like a suffocating fog for Brad. He couldn't stop replaying the encounter with the man. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that steady, piercing gaze, the calm but firm tone of voice. The words echoed in his mind over and over. You have to live with that? He tried to go back to his usual routine. Hanging out with Kyle and Chris at the park, joking around, drinking beer, trying to push everything from his mind. But something had shifted. He couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him. Every time he laughed with Kyle or made a joke with Chris, there was a quiet voice in the back of his head telling him he wasn't the person he thought he was. That he wasn't as innocent as he had always believed. Kyle noticed the change. Brad, what's going on? You've been quiet, man. What happened to you? Brad had no answer. He couldn't explain it. He didn't have the words to explain the weight he felt. He tried to shrug it off, tried to convince himself that he was overthinking it. But he wasn't. The unease, the shame, it was always there. It wasn't long before Brad saw the man again. He hadn't expected it, but as he was walking down the same street, heading toward the park, he saw him, the wheelchair, the same calm demeanor. But this time, There was something different about him. His presence felt like a force, pulling Brad in, forcing him to confront what had happened. The man wasn't alone. He was with a group of people, others in wheelchairs, some with canes, others walking with the help of prosthetics. They were all talking quietly amongst themselves, their heads held high, their postures strong despite their visible disabilities. It was like they had been there the whole time, but Brad had never noticed them. Now, standing in front of him, they all seemed to exude a quiet strength that Brad had never thought possible. Brad froze, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to walk away, to avoid the confrontation. But his feet didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, watching them approach. The man from the alley was at the front of the group. His eyes locked onto Brad's, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to vanish. It was just the two of them standing there, the air between them charged with the tension of unspoken truths. Brad took a step forward, his heart racing. "I didn't mean what I said," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. The words felt hollow, as if they had no real weight behind them. He wanted to make it right, but even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't enough. The man's expression was unreadable. "No," he said softly, "you didn't. But you have to understand something." He paused, and the others in the group stopped walking, standing in a loose circle around Brad. "You may not have meant it, but that doesn't change the impact of your actions." Brad felt a wave of heat rise in his chest. "I get it, okay? I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you. I shouldn't have said what I said." The man didn't reply immediately. He just watched Brad, his eyes steady, unwavering. It was as if he were looking past Brad, seeing something deeper, something that Brad couldn't understand. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Brad's thoughts were racing. What does he want from me? He wanted to be forgiven, but he didn't know if it was even possible. He didn't deserve forgiveness. The man had been right. He had judged him without a second thought, just because of his appearance, just because he was different. And now Brad had to face the consequences of that. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know who I am, Brad?" Brad blinked, caught off guard. I don't. I don't think so." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't warm. "I'm a world champion," he said simply. "In my sport, I'm one of the best. And I've been through more than you can imagine. But none of that matters to you, does it?" Brad opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had no idea. He had assumed, like everyone else, that the man was just another person to be dismissed, someone easy to ridicule. And now, in front of him, was someone far stronger, far more accomplished than Brad could ever imagine. The group behind the man nodded in quiet agreement, their faces calm but resolute. "We're not just people you can walk past, Brad," one of them spoke up, her voice firm. "You think because we have disabilities, we don't have the same strength? The same drive?" Brad stood there, paralyzed, his stomach sinking. He had no idea what to say. The truth was, he hadn't seen them as people, not really. He hadn't taken the time to understand, to ask questions. He had just assumed they were weaker, somehow less than him. And now, in front of him, was the truth he had refused to see. The man shook his head slowly. "You need to stop seeing people like us as less. That's your problem, Brad. You've spent your whole life judging people based on what you see on the surface. But you don't know us. You don't know what we've been through. You don't know our strength." Brad swallowed hard, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say. There was no easy excuse, no way to fix what had happened. All he could do was stand there, silent, and listen. "Actions have consequences," the man continued. But they can also teach us something. I hope this teaches you something, Brad. Because until you see the world through other people's eyes, you'll never understand the real strength of a person. The man turned to leave, and his group followed silently. As they rolled away, Brad stood frozen, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The world felt different now. His shame weighed on him like a heavy cloak. He couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't pretend it didn't matter. This was his reckoning. And Brad knew, as he stood there in the street, that this would stay with him forever. Brad couldn't shake the feeling. Days passed, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, calm, unflinching, powerful. Every moment in his life, every laugh with his friends, every passing second felt like a reminder of the choice he had made and the consequences that had followed. The weight on his chest seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him, and every time he passed by a group of people, he wondered if they were judging him too. His routine had been shattered. His friends, Kyle and Chris, noticed the change, but Brad couldn't bring himself to explain it. He had tried to move past it, but the man's words, "Actions have consequences," haunted him. Brad had spent most of his life thinking he was better, more deserving, simply because of his privilege. He had never thought twice about people who were different, until now. The unease gnawed at him, and the longer he avoided it, the worse it became. The guilt, the shame, it was suffocating. But what could he do? He had made a choice, and now he had to live with it. Then, on one restless evening, it happened again. Brad was walking home from the convenience store when he saw a group of people in the distance. It was the same group, the same man in the wheelchair. His eyes immediately locked onto Brad's, just like before. But this time, it wasn't the calm recognition he had seen last time. There was something more, something darker. Brad's heart pounded in his chest as he stopped in his tracks. His legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. The man, flanked by others in the group, was moving in his direction. This wasn't accidental. He knew what was coming. The group stopped in front of him, and the man rolled his wheelchair a few inches forward, locking eyes with Brad. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brad couldn't breathe. His thoughts were racing, trying to piece together a response, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. "You think I'm going to let you forget?" The man finally spoke, his voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "You thought I was going to walk away, didn't you?" Brad's mouth went dry, but he found his voice. "I didn't think. I didn't mean. You didn't think." The man's voice rose slightly, a subtle edge to his tone. "That's the problem, Brad. You didn't think about the things you said or the damage you caused." Brad shifted uncomfortably, his palms sweaty. "I said I was sorry. What do you want from me?" The man's gaze darkened, and the group behind him seemed to tighten their circle. There was nowhere for Brad to hide, no easy way to escape. "I want you to understand something," the man continued, leaning forward in his chair, his hands gripping the wheels as if he were preparing to stand, as if he could have if he wanted to. "You walked all over me. You walked all over people like me. And I want to make sure you know that. I want you to remember this moment. Every time you think about hurting someone, every time you judge someone based on what you see, I want you to remember this." Brad's eyes were wide now, his entire body tense, every muscle locked in place. The group behind the man began to close in, their eyes sharp, their postures demanding. They weren't here just for words. Brad could feel it. There was a growing power in their presence, something he hadn't recognized before. Something deeper than just their physical appearance. He looked at the man, his mind struggling to process everything. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to understand. I want you to know that we are not less than you. I want you to know that we have the same rights, the same strengths, the same power to take control of our lives as anyone else. We don't need your pity, Brad. We don't need your apologies. We need respect." Brad felt a deep, uncomfortable twist in his stomach. He wasn't prepared for this. He thought he had learned something in that moment outside the store, but this was different. It wasn't enough just to say sorry. The man's words were hitting him harder than he anticipated. He thought he understood the consequences, but he hadn't realized the depth of what he had done. He hadn't understood the magnitude of his actions. A silence lingered between them. Brad stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. He had spent so much time in his life trying to avoid the truth, trying to distance himself from things that made him uncomfortable. But this moment, this confrontation, was forcing him to face something he could no longer ignore. He had judged this man, this group of people, without knowing a thing about them. And now he had to face the consequences. The man finally broke the silence, his tone softer but still firm. "You can't change the past, Brad. But you can learn from it. You can change what's to come. But it starts now." Brad nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. He wanted to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew deep down that wasn't what was needed. What they wanted, what he needed, was more than just words. It was action. The man's eyes softened, just for a moment, and Brad could see it, the weariness of someone who had fought their whole life just to be seen. "I hope you remember this," he said quietly. "Not just today, but every day." As the group began to move past him, Brad stood still, his body trembling with emotion. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix what he had broken. But he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away from this. He had to confront it, had to confront himself. For the first time in his life, Brad understood what it meant to be judged, to be looked at and dismissed without a second thought. And in that moment, as the group faded into the distance, he realized that his journey had only just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the road he had to take, one that would demand honesty, humility, and, above all, respect. And he was ready, though terrified, to walk it. The days following the confrontation weighed heavily on Brad. Each morning, the unease gnawed at him like a persistent ache. He felt the sting of every passing glance, every whispered word. The memory of the man in the wheelchair haunted him, not just his face, but the quiet power in his words. The lessons he had taught Brad weren't easily shaken, and each interaction, every moment spent walking through life, felt tainted by the lingering guilt. It wasn't that Brad didn't want to change, he did. But the weight of his past actions, the deep-seated prejudices he had always carried, made it hard to break free. How could he undo years of ignorance? How could he start to see the world in a new light when his past choices felt like a heavy shadow that wouldn't let go? That evening, as the sun set and the familiar hum of the city streets filled the air, Brad walked to the same convenience store where it had all started. He needed something, a moment of clarity, a chance to understand what had happened to him. As he entered, he noticed the store was quieter than usual, the shelves lined with everyday items that suddenly seemed so distant. His mind was a mess of thoughts, a whirlwind of confusion. Had the man really changed him? He wasn't sure. Could one moment in time be enough to alter everything? The bell above the door jingled softly as Brad walked deeper into the store. He was just about to grab a drink when he saw a familiar figure standing by the aisle, the man. The same man from the wheelchair. He was standing there, no wheelchair, no sign of injury, but his presence was unmistakable. Brad's breath caught in his throat. The man turned and their eyes met. There was no recognition in Brad's gaze. There was no anger in the man's eyes either. It was almost as if time had stopped. The world around them seemed to blur, leaving only the two of them in a vacuum of uneasy silence. "What are you doing here?" Brad asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. The man didn't flinch. His expression was calm, but there was a hard edge beneath it, a quiet, unspoken power that Brad couldn't quite place. "Did you think it was over, Brad?" The man's voice was steady, but there was a weight in his words, an undeniable truth. "You think that just because I walked away from you, it's all done?" Brad swallowed. His hands trembled. He wasn't prepared for this. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know what you want from me." The man stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating now. Brad couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man's eyes locked onto his, and it felt like every bad decision he had ever made in his life was laid bare in that single, unrelenting gaze. "I told you before, Brad. I want you to understand. I want you to feel this discomfort, this guilt, this truth. And you're not going to escape it. Not now. Not ever." Brad's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to shout, to protest, but he knew, deep down, there was no denying it. He couldn't run away from what he had done, and he couldn't erase the impact of his actions. For the first time, Brad truly realized how deeply he had failed. He had hurt someone. He had made them feel less than human. And now, the weight of that was crushing him. He wanted to make things right, but the path forward seemed impossible, too distant, too complex. The man's gaze softened, just slightly. "You've got a long way to go, Brad. But if you want to change, if you really want to fix this, you need to do more than say you're sorry. You need to make it right. You need to stand up, not just for yourself, but for the people you've hurt. And that starts now." Brad's breath was shallow. His palms were clammy. It felt like the entire world had contracted, leaving him with nothing but the truth. The weight of his own ignorance, his own cruelty, seemed to close in on him, suffocating him from all sides. The man stood still, his presence unwavering. He wasn't asking for an apology anymore, he was demanding action. And Brad realized that he had no choice but to face it. "I'm sorry," Brad whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his emotions. "I'm so sorry." The man nodded, not a smile, but a flicker of something that felt like understanding. "Sorry is a start. But it's not enough." Brad nodded, the realization hitting him with brutal clarity. This was bigger than him. Bigger than anything he could fix in a single moment. But it was a start. And the hardest part was acknowledging that it wasn't just about fixing the past, it was about changing the future. The man turned, walking toward the exit without another word. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back, his gaze never leaving Brad's. "Remember," he said softly, "actions have consequences. But so does change. You can't change the world in a day, but you can change yourself." Brad stood frozen in place, the silence ringing in his ears. For a moment, everything around him felt distant. The sound of the hum of the store, the ticking of the clock on the wall, everything faded away. The man disappeared out the door, and Brad was left standing there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, forcing him to face the uncomfortable truth he had tried to avoid for so long. This was the beginning, not just of his story, but of something much larger. A journey he didn't know how to finish, but one he had no choice but to start. Brad took a deep breath. The air was still heavy with the remnants of guilt and shame, but something else had taken root inside him. It was fragile, but it was there. The journey was long. The change wouldn't come easy. But Brad knew one thing now. He had to walk this path, step by painful step, if he ever hoped to truly understand. And with that he walked out of the store. The door closed behind him, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was moving toward something real.